Welcome to the Hurricane Florence edition of the first part of Chapter 4 lecture on documenting information systems. I'm not going to sit here and read everything to you, but what I do want to do is work through this lecture and hit the high points to help get you prepared for what we're going to do, because we only have 2 days that we're going to be working with the data flow diagrams, and then it's going to be up to you to work on the homework assignments. And the thing I kind of want to say on the front end is that I will be available to help out, and if necessary, I'll have a session that is held when none of the classes are to work a little bit more on data flow diagrams if anybody wants it. One thing I want to start off with, and I've kind of beat this to death, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just to remind you that you need to customize your data flow diagram homework to the assignment. And if you copy just what is out of the textbook, I'm going to give you 0. And that became a big problem last year, or it was enough of a problem and enough people did it that I've decided to crack down on it. And the other thing is, I had some students after the semester were over that were a little frustrated that they made an honest effort. And I was giving partial credit to people who were using or trying to make what was in the book. So, you need to work on your own and hand in your own work. So I'm not going to talk any more about that. Drawing symbols, I had put up on As You Learn underneath this video, or in the same place that this video is, 01.08 data flow diagram symbols. It's a handout, and the thing is that I'm not going to give you the answers to it, but you need to work on that to prepare for the exam. Because on the exam there are questions where you have to identify certain drawing symbols. And in class, what I would have started the class off with is handing out the blank template, let you work through it for about 5 minutes, then we would have gone through it where you had it in class. And since we're not having class, you can work on that on your own. On your own. So why do you document information systems? The thing is that the reason that you do it is that it's part of accounting right now, and that part of accounting lets you understand what the processes are. There are standards like SOX 404 and Auditing Standards 5, where you have to have an understanding of internal controls and the way you, in auditing and in even working in managerial accounting, if you're working as a staff accountant for a company, the way you understand the internal controls of a system is to document those systems. So the thing is, what's right here, who prepares documentation? External auditors, internal auditors, financial managers, business process owners. Pretty much any job that is inside of a public accounting firm or an industry that's accounting, that involves accounting, could possibly be people who are going to document it. And the thing with me, just in my career as a CPA, I went through the process you're going to go through here, where when I did audits, I would go and understand a client's systems. I would write a narrative, and then I would create the documentation off the narrative. So at the end of the day, you will likely be documenting information systems in your career. And I know that some of you were at the junior year experience, where a recent grad from App State, and I've said this several times, spends a lot of her time in her professional job right now documenting systems. So it's something that you're going to be expected to know the basics of and be able to adapt and do when you're working in industry or public accounting. And systems flow charts that I'm not going to have you draw, but you do need to have an understanding of it for the exam. They're a comprehensive picture of everything. So the thing is, with a data flow diagram that we're going to cover in class, it slices of specific things in a systems and internal controls. A systems flow chart, you can look at and understand everything. The logical data flow and also the physical data flow. This is one warning I want to give, is that you can't achieve the chapter's objectives by traditional passive study methods, which is read the PowerPoints, listen to this lecture, and then just hack around to figure out how to do it. This is something that you have to roll your sleeves up and invest the time to learn. And since we've got a class canceled, you're going to have to do this on your own time. And I hope that you take the time to work through, when I have pauses in this, pause the video and work the assignments I would have worked in class. So types of systems documentation, a narrative is just a written out narrative that describes how the system describes a system that's being documented. Then you have a tables of entities and activities, and I'll talk a little bit later what entities and activities are. You have a context diagram, which is really the most simplest diagram, and it's a top level diagram of a system. You've got a physical data flow diagram, which shows the system's internal and external entities and the flow of data between those entities. And then a logical data flow diagram shows the system's processes and the flows between the processes, and then a system flow chart, which really kind of brings everything together where you can have a complete understanding of the system. So a data flow diagrams are graphical representations of a system. They describe the components and the flows among the components. There's a limited number of systems with data flow diagrams. You've got a circle, you've got a box, and then you've got arrows, and then you've got where you put storage. So preparing a data flow diagram, you first have a narrative, and in this class you're going to be given the narrative. There's a real good chance that when you get into practice, one of your team members or you are going to prepare the narrative. And then you create a table of entities and activities from the narrative, and then you prepare the data flow diagrams. And in class, we're going to learn about logical and physical data flow diagrams. Here's the narrative that is out of the book. And you're going to be able to find this narrative in the PDF that I put up, 0208 Data Flow Diagram Narratives handout. This is the one that's in the book, and if we were in the classroom, what I would ask you to do is close your laptops and other devices, and then what I would want you to do is place an oval or circle around each activity being performed, both internal and external, and place a square around the entity performing the activity. And I would have just left you at this, and I'd like for you to take a moment and do it with the narrative. And then in a minute, then what I'm going to do is I'll pause about 5 seconds. I'm going to move on, and I'll do what I would have done in class. So here is my marked up narrative. And the thing you can see here is the customer is the entity, and this is your activity, give orders. And the thing is, this is one of the parts of diagramming that, yes, you have to have all the entities, you have to have all the activities, but there are different ways that you can do it. And there are times when you'll end up having customer and you'll only circle customer once, and then every activity in that paragraph or 2 paragraphs you'll do the oval with. And there are some people that will go in and do the customer in each line. It's up to you to do it, but you can see here, customer gives order. You've got sales representative, enter customer order, 2 copies of the order are printed, then the sales rep, copy 1 given the customer, retains copy 2, then you've got laptop retrieves day's orders. One thing I want to point out about here, make sure when you're doing it, you do separate those entities. Because when you're just learning, you may say, okay, the salesman is the person who's entering the data, so the salesman and the salesman laptop are basically the same. But when you're diagramming and when you're marking up a narrative, they're not the same. So in this case, you've got the sales rep is entering the order, so that's one entity that's doing something. And then you've got the laptop is where the data is being processed, so it's 2 different entities, and just something to be aware of when you're working through this. And here is the other one, and you've got a copy of this PowerPoint available. I'll make sure that a copy of this PowerPoint is available so you can check your work on this. So preparing a table of entities and activities, you're going to see on the PDFs I put up, 03.08 table of entities and activities. And what that is, that's just a blank table. And at this point, what I would have done is explain to you what the headings were, and then given everybody in the class probably 5 minutes or 10 minutes to work through and create your own table of entities and activities off of this. And I'd like to do that right now. And I'll be back in 2 seconds. So here's the table of entities and activities for Sabrina, and you can see how it's in chronological order that coincides with the chronological order of the narrative. And also what it does is it has an entry for each one of the entities. It is quite all right that if you have one section of a narrative, and like in this case, a sales rep laptop, it's not going to cost you points on what you hand in if you put sales rep laptop, and it's not going to cost you points if it's sales rep laptop and then you drop down to that next line because I know what it is. And that is, as long as you segregate them the way they're segregated here. And you can see table of entities and activities separates them into the different entities and the activities that are within those entities in chronological order. So you've got customer, gives order to sales rep enter customer order data, sales rep laptop, add order to daily order files, and then the sales rep laptop prints customer order 2 copies. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can take your marked up table of entities and you can take your marked up narrative, compare it to your tables of entities and activities, and kind of problem solve if you didn't get all the entities and activities documented correctly when you worked on it. I do want to make a point. Get in the habit. The template that I've given you in the 03 PowerPoint has entities, paragraphs, activities. You do need in what you hand in to me to have entities, paragraph, activities, even though the Kennesaw B2B narrative is only 1 paragraph. So just keep that in mind, that I want you to, what I'm giving you is something that is simple to work on. And I know it's not simple to you because you don't have experience with it, but for somebody who's in public accounting, it would be a simpler activity or assignment. But I do want you to start getting into the habit of putting what paragraph the activity is in, and that is documentation in public accounting and documentation when you're diagramming your data flows and documenting your systems, where somebody else can come behind you and be able to see what you did and determine what you did just by looking at your documentation. And that's why I'm asking you to do it, just to get into the habit. So this is the whole table. Once you have a table of entities and activities done, then you move on to doing a context diagram. And what a context diagram is, it's really the top level graphical representation of a system, showing the system's internal and then all the external activities. And this is the deal with a context diagram. What you're doing with a context diagram is with the circle, which is the internal entity. What you're wanting to do is capture all the internal processes within that internal entity, is what you're trying to do. And then you've got your relationships to your external entities. And an internal entity is an entity in a system that transforms data. An example of that would be accounting clerk, department, a computer. It's going to be nouns. And your entities are going to be nouns in a context diagram. And it gives you the how, whom, and where, but not the what. So these are the data flow diagram symbols. A bubble is an internal entity. A square is an external entity. You have the arrow to show the pathway, and then the 2 parallel lines is a data store symbol, and that is where you're electronically storing data for the sake of this class. So the thing is, context diagram, as I said, it's top level, least detailed, and an external entity is something that does not perform information processing activities. I want to take a minute and stop here and make a comment, or pause here because I'm not stopping. Pause here and make a comment about external and internal entities. What you have to do is take the time to understand what that entity is doing to be able to identify whether it's internal or external. And to give you an example of that, if you have a customer and the customer initiates the call, initiates the sale, just by telling a sales rep, this is what I want, and placing the order by phone or sitting in the office, the customer is going to be an external entity. On the other side of it is if you have a customer that is logging on into your system and logging into your ERP through a customer portal, and they're entering all the information and they're approving the information and they're putting in their payment information and credit card information, that makes the customer an internal entity because they're transforming data and doing data processing activities. So the thing is, don't just get in your mind, hey, that's a customer. We learned in Sabrina that a customer is an external entity, so it always is. That's not the case. You have to look at what the customer is doing, and if all the customer is doing is just telling a sales rep, here's what I want to buy, then it's going to be an external entity. But if the customer is logging on and is processing data, as in putting in their information, choosing from the catalog that's online for what they're wanting to order, they could be an internal entity. And that's just something I'm going to harp on it because that's one of the areas of diagramming that last year students struggled with. So here is the context diagram for Sabrina. That's not Sabrina. This is a context diagram from the book, and what you can see is, and what I was talking about earlier, you've got your customer and your bank or your external entities, cash receipts process. You're taking all those activities that apply to the internal entities and you're putting them into one bubble, and what you're doing is you are coming up with a name for that bubble that encapsulates the whole process. So data flow diagram guidelines, you can read that yourself. These are the ones that have to do with, and they're in the book for drawing a context diagram. Here's a Sabrina diagram. So what you would do in class is that I have a handout that is called 04.08 in-class context diagram and gives you place to do or to draw the context diagram on paper in class. What I like to do is I'm going to pause for about 5 seconds and let you pause this video and work through the Sabrina context diagram using your table of entities and activities, and then I'll show you it. And especially if you saw where I went forward accidentally and showed it real quick on the next slide. All right, here's the Sabrina context diagram. And in this case, the customer is an external entity. Warehouse is an external entity. And as you can see, what you're doing is you are taking all of the activities that are internal activities and putting them into one bubble. And it's the high level that's called Sabrina order entry process. But also notice in a context diagram, everything that's internal, all the entities and activities that are internal are encapsulated here. But then with your external entities, all of the relationships from the narrative are shown graphically in the diagram. So you've got the customer order, that goes into the order entry process. Of course, customer from the laptop. If you remember from the narrative, customer order acknowledgement is sent and sales order acknowledgement is sent from the system. And then it works its way through the internal processes. The point of picking ticket is done that's sent to the warehouse, which is the final external entity that picks the goods and ships them to the customer. One kind of thing about doing diagramming is that you want to make sure that you go from the top left to the bottom right. That's just proper protocol. So let's move on to a physical data flow diagram. Physical data flow, it represents a system showing internal, external entities and the flows of data in and out of those entities. And as I said earlier, it shows where, how, and whom, but does not specify what is being accomplished. Internal entities are those things that they're person, places, and things outside the system that send data to or receive data from the system, as in the customer or the warehouse, and an internal entity transforms data. So I have several times in this, as you can see, that to distinguish between internal and external entity is, does it transform data? And another thing about data flow diagrams is they have to be balanced. And what balance means is you start with a context diagram and you've got the customer and warehouse as external entities. To be balanced, when you create the physical data flow diagram or the logical data flow diagram, you want to have those same external entities. So here's the Sabrina context diagram again. And you can see where you've got the customer as an external entity, the warehouse as an external entity, and what you're going to do with the physical data flow diagram is expand that Sabrina order entry process for each individual entity that is within that internal entity in the context diagram Sabrina order entry process. So you've got here, there are your external entities, then you're expanding your internal entities. So Sabrina physical data flow diagram from your Sabrina table of entities and activities. You have to ask yourself, what are the external activities? What do you think the internal entities should be? And what are the data stores? And in class, I would have written this up on the board. Every internal entity has a bubble on the physical data flow diagram. What are the internal bubble numbers? And then make sure that you number them in chronological order. If I were giving this lecture in class tomorrow, I would write these on the board and then I would bring this slide up. So you've got 1.0 as your sales rep, 2.0 sales rep laptop, 3.0 customer, and 4.0 order entry clerk. So drawing a physical data flow diagram, start with your external entities, then draw your internal entity bubbles, draw your data stores, and then draw the flows between the two. That helps you to be able to put it where it's readable. And also you can work with it or other people can work with it. So let me tell you how I prepare and draw data flow diagrams. I start with the table of entity activities, and then what I do is I document the flows before I draw the data flow diagram. And if you document the flows before you start drawing the diagram, what ends up happening is all you got to do is just draw. And you're not having to think while you're drawing. And from my experience, it's better to go ahead and do the hard work up front. And then all you're doing is you're just laying out your diagram. Because if you start trying to think through things while you're working on the diagram, what you run into is, well, I forgot something. Then you've got to start moving stuff around. So I really recommend having this discipline. So the thing is, document your flows before drawing the diagram. And the way I do it is document flows to and from external entities to internal entities, document the flows among the internal entities, then document the flows between the internal entities and data stores. So the thing is, in class, I would have stopped and had talked it out in the front of the class where we would have worked this and worked it on the board. What I'm about to show you is how I work the problems. I have worked all the physical and logical data flow diagrams that are in the textbook, and then I created the Kennesaw B2B one. And in all of them, when I worked through the solution and worked through the problems, this is how I did it. I had a Word document, and I started out by saying, all right, external to internal entities, and then I documented all of them underneath there. So you've got your customer external entity to 1.0 sales rep. The first flow is your customer order data, customer to 1.0 sales rep, and then customer order copy, 1.0 sales rep to customer. And you're using your, and then I would have stopped here and said, I'm going to give you a few minutes to document the rest of your data flows. I'm going to pause a minute and let you, if you want to, I really recommend you pause the video and work like you would in class. I would have given you 5 to 10 minutes. And I wouldn't have put it on the board. I was wrong about that. The previous slide, I would have put it on the board. On this one, I would have given you a minute to write it out on paper, and I would have handed the paper out. So I'm going to pause for a minute, a few seconds, let you pause the video, work on it, and I'll come back and work through what I did. All right, we're back. So this is actually, I worked the Sabrina problem. And where I came up with the bullet points on this slide was actually copying and pasting from the Word document I did that I created for this. So internal, external entities, and then I tab over customer 1.0 to sales rep. I've already been through those. The next one is going to be sales order acknowledgement, which is going to be 3.0 customer to computer, and ACK is just a short for acknowledgement. So underneath there, 3.0 customer to computer, and then warehouse to computer, sales order copy to computer 3.0 to warehouse. And notice what I've done here. I have given the external entity, and then I've given the number and the entity name. And that's just good protocol to put in your work papers, because at the end of the day, what you're doing when you create work papers is creating work papers that somebody else can look at the next year, or a supervisor can look at, or one of your team members can look at, and they can recreate what you did from your documentation. Then the next thing I do is, once I've done the external entities to the internal entities, I'm going to document the flows between the internal entities. So here you've got 1.0 sales rep to 2.0 sales rep laptops. You've got order data, 1.0 sales rep to sales rep computer, and then customer order 2 copies, the sales rep computer to the sales rep. And this is why it's important and imperative, that you identify what are the entities and make sure you separate them, because when you're just learning this, it's real easy to say, okay, the laptop and the customer and the customer service rep are the same person, or the sales rep, and they're not. Then you've got 2.0 sales rep laptop to 3.0 computer. You've got your daily orders, which is 2.0 sales rep laptop to the 3.0 computer. Remember, we talked about batch processing. This could be a situation where the salesman is out in the field, is not hooked up with their laptop to the computer or Wi-Fi. And then at the end of the day, they're back at their office and they upload all their orders to the computer at the company, main computer or central computer at the company. Then you've got 3.0 computer to 4.0 order entry clerk, customer orders and totals. 3.0 computer to 4.0 order entry clerk, and a request to begin processing 4.0 order entry clerk to 3.0 computer. Notice something about this. The entities and activities are lifted directly from the table of entities and activities. And if you go pull up the table of entities and activities, you're going to see it's the same wording and same entities that are on that. Then what I do is document between internal entities and data stores. So you've got here 1.0 sales rep to data store goes to the customer order file, and data store is both paper and electronic. And then the laptop to data store, you've got 2.0 sales reps laptop to the daily order files, which is going to be on disk. And then 3.0 computer to the data store. This is updating all of this is updating or flows that are going between the main computer and where the storage is for each of the individual data stores. So you've got the customer orders file. That's one that's going to be updated. Customer master data is not going to be updated, so it's only retrieving information from this. Inventory master data is the same thing. It's only going to be retrieving it. The accounts receivable master data is going to be updated, and the sales order master file is going to be updated. So here's how I draw data flow diagrams. I draw the external entities, then the internal, and then the data stores, and then the flows. At this point, I'm going to just pause for a few seconds. You can pause the video, and why don't you try and work through the Sabrina physical data flow diagram yourself. And then I'll show you what I did. Here's the physical data flow diagram for Sabrina. And notice you've got the same external entities, so it's balanced. And then in here, you've got your internal entities and in chronological order. And part of the thing about doing all the work up front and doing the tables of entities and activities is it helps you to lay it out, because you may start laying it diagonally, and then when you start adding stuff, if you're trying to build it at the same time, you're going to cause a lot of work for yourself moving stuff around. But you can see here and working through it, the customer orders the data, that paper copy is given, and the customer rep enters that into the laptop. 2 orders are printed out of the laptop, and then you've got the daily order batch going to the computer, and then you've got the order entry clerk who's looking at the totals and requests that the process begin. We're going to talk about batch totals and things like that in internal control chapter. So let's stop here, and then what I want to do is real quick is let's pull up goodbyes, and if you look in the data flow diagram narrative that I put up, which is 0208 data flow diagram, what would have happened in class? We would have worked through the subpoena and gone through it kind of quickly, and then probably the last 40 minutes of class, we would have ended up working on the maybe 30, 40 minutes of class, we would have ended up working on the goodbyes, which is one of the problems in the back of chapter 4. So the first thing you have to do is mark up the narrative. And what I'd like you to do is, and I would have stopped here in class, pull up the 0208 data flow diagram narratives and mark up your narrative for the goodbyes case using circle oval for each activity and put a square around each entity. And then I'll walk through what I did with mine. All right, here is my marked up, and what you can see here is you can see customer logs on to goodbye computer, web server, requests at current goodbye online catalog. You've got your server, customer, web server edits a customer entity accurately, sends lists to ERP systems, and inventory are allocated for sales. And that's the thing I was telling you, that when you order on eBay and there are 3 left and it ends up putting a hold on that piece of inventory, that's what's happening here, is that the inventory is being allocated for sale so somebody else can't buy it. And you go through here and see one thing to point out here, and I did this intentionally. If you're handing in to me a marked up entities of marked up narrative, there isn't any one exact way to do it. And here's an example of it. This isn't a creative process, but what you do have with this is that you have some flexibility in how you document. And I can give you an example of it here. Web server displays confirmation number, and notice that since the web server was in the next line and chronologically the next thing being done, I could have come in here and put a square around web server, but I chose not to. And that's an example of how if you're handing or showing me a marked up narrative, it's not something that is going to get marked up or marked against you, because there are 2 ways to do it. You could put web server, or you can just do web server and then just circle these until you come to the next entity. So this will be up so you can see how you did, and then prepare a table of entities and activities. What I would have done in class, I would have stopped, given you 5 to 10 minutes, and let you work on table of entity and activities for goodbye case. I'm going to pause right now and then come back in a few seconds. I hope you pause the video and work through laying this in a table of entities and activities. All right, here is the table of entities and activities I created, and I just did this in Excel. I went through and marked up the narrative, and then in Excel put this out. It's kind of the easiest way to do, and this is just the table of entities and activities I came up with. And you can see that I like using the protocol web server, and then there are 2 things within the web server, but it would not be wrong, and it wouldn't be counted against you if you put customer here, web server, web server, web server, web server. This is neater and cleaner to look at, and it is more the standard protocol, but if you did it the other way, that would be acceptable too. So drawing a context diagram, remember it only has one circle in the center of the page. I would have talked out in class here what are good names for the center circle and the external entities. I call the center circle order entry sales process, or OES. We're going to be learning more detail about that later. The external entities are credit card processing company and the warehouse. So the thing is that mark activities that do not involve information processing and identify data flows to external entities. What are the data flows to external entities, and what are good logical labels for them? Would have, through class, worked this out, written it on the board. My logical labels were request verification from credit card company, receive verification number from credit card company, picking ticket and packing slip. I'm going to pause and let you work on your context diagram. Here's the context diagram I came with. Internal entity is going to be order entry sales process. That's what I called it. It's the high level, top level. External entities, credit card processing company and warehouse. Then I have request verification from credit card company. Then receive verification number from credit card company. And then picking ticket and packing slip. That's a typo. Picking ticket and packing slip. So there are the table of entities and activities that I showed a minute ago. So now let's have you create a physical data flow diagram on this good buys case. So the thing is, the internal entities and external entities, we talked about internal entities transform data and the external entities send data. You got to make sure it's balanced, that you have the same number of external entities as you do in your context diagram. So we talked about the external entities, credit card, processing company, and warehouse. Internal entities, I would ask in class, as your customer, web server, ERP. All internal entities are on the entities and activities table. So you've got here customer, and this is in the Sabrina, the customer was an external entity because the customer just sent the data or told the sales rep what they wanted. In this good buys case, the customer is an internal entity because the customer is processing data. And if you read through the narrative, you see that the customer is processing data. And you notice that here, customer selects items and quantities. That's processing data, pulling up the inventory table from the web server and then marking what inventory they want. And then over here, customer verifies the order and enters shipping and credit card information. That's processing data, which makes the customer an internal entity in this case. So what should the bubble numbers be? And in class, I would have written this on the board. What are the bubbles? 1.0 is your customer, 2.0 is your web server, and 3.0 is your ERP, and that little asterisk is next to it, just to emphasize that the customer is an internal entity in this data flow diagram. So what are the data stores? Would I ask them on the board? Sales data, AR master data, and inventory master data. And I kind of want to bring up a point here. Please don't overthink what just don't overthink when you're putting together tables of entities and activities and working through the narrative. Only work with what is in the narrative. And what I mean by that is don't add things into the data flow diagram that are not in the narrative in the table of entities and activities. And here you may think you've got a sales data store, AR master data, inventory master data. Don't overthink it and say, well, there needs to be a customer master data here. Because it's not in the narrative, it does not belong into any activities, data flow diagramming, or tables that you're doing for this case. So Thing is that this is how I identify the start with external entities and I work through the flows. And the thing is, when I, like with the Sabrina, when I was working on the Goodbyes case a couple of summers ago and I was working this homework problem or this problem in the book, I had a Word document, and this is how I did it in the Word document. When I created this PowerPoint, all I did was copy between the two, copy between them. So you've got credit card processing company, which is external to your web server, credit card data purchase to credit card data and purchase amount 2.0 to the external with web server to the external credit card processing company. Then your verification number that comes back from your credit card company, that's external to 2.0. Warehouse to 3.0 ERP, picking ticket and packing slip. And that's just a typo, that should be 3.0. And then internal entities, 1.0 to 2.0 web server. These are all the data flows from the table of entities and activities. And remember, when you're writing this out, it comes directly from the table of entities and activities. So you've got your logon data, your catalog data, requested items, allocated items and quantities, shipping and credit card data and confirmation number, and the flows to the side tell which way the flow goes between the internal entities, which, as I talked about earlier, are numbered chronologically. So you've got your 2.0 server to 3.0 ERP, requested items and quantities, current catalog available items and quantities, catalog request, sales completion notification, activities that are directly off the table of entities and activities. So your entities to data stores, 3.0 to AR master data, ERP system to inventory master data. And this is one thing to be very careful of. Make sure you document every flow between the internal entity and the data stores. And that's something that when I'm grading the homework, I count the flows, because you are probably in the data flow diagram, you're not going to label what each of the arrows are. You do in the context diagram, but you're probably not going to have room to label each arrow. So the way that I check to see if you are understanding what it is to count those flows and see which ways the flows go. So in here, you've got inventory available. That's where the ERP is checking the inventory master data. ERP request inventory be allocated, so you're having a hold put on that inventory in the inventory data store or master data. Data store confirms the inventory allocation. ERP request allocated be marked as sold, and data store confirms inventory allocation is sold. And then the thing is, if you kind of notice here, if you go ahead and document all this, what you're going to see is that it is pretty straightforward, and all you have to do is just worry about setting up your drawing, as opposed to trying to figure this out while you're working on your drawing. And then you've got 3.0 ERP to sales master data, 3.0 ERP updates the sales master data. Draw bubbles for the internal entities. First draw bubbles connected to the external entities, then go through the entities and activities table and identify the internal entities. These are your guidelines, and you can read them. They're in the book. At this point in class, and this would have bled into Tuesday's class, and I probably would have stopped here, and then we would have started working on the diagram at the first of next Tuesday's class. But I'm going to go ahead and let you start working on this, because the homework is open, and with the downtime you're going to have, you may want to go ahead and get started on the homework. I'm going to pause for a minute and let you work on the physical data flow diagram for this. All right, here is the physical data flow diagram I drew. And notice it's not a masterpiece, and I intentionally did it the way I did it. And notice something. You have a activity on all the arrows between the entities, but you don't have a description going to the data stores. And I am completely fine with that. And that's why I kind of harped a couple of slides ago that I'm going to go in and count your flows. And in this case, what I would do is, I know that there should be 5 flows to inventory master data. and that 2 of them are going to the inventory master data and 3 are coming out, and I'm just going to sit and count. And that's how I grade, is counting to make sure you've got the flows. There is no hard fast rule that you have to have the external entity in the top left. You just want your flow to go that way. And in this case, the customer is an internal entity, and the customer is the one who initiates the process. So it's completely acceptable to put the customer up on the top left-hand corner. So that's all I have for this very quick and abbreviated lecture. And the thing is, I hope it gets you started. You know how to get in touch with me if you need help. And if we get into next week and it looks like that you individually are wanting some help, or help as in the exercises that are in class, I want you to struggle and work with your homework. That's just part of the class. But if it comes down to it that you think that this is too rushed and you want a little more help on Soprano or goodbyes, I'll be glad to do it in class on Tuesday. And if we don't have time for in class on Tuesday, then what I'll end up doing is possibly having a help session sometime over the next week. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you find it helpful, and I will see you on Tuesday. And stay safe, and I hope your family and friends stay safe.